right, good evening, everybody. For our March demo, we are going to have our very own Jeff Edwards. He's going to be making some of these lovely boxes, or a lovely box for us, and show us how to do that tonight. And with that, I'm going to let Jeff take it over. Jeff, please.
Thanks, John. Sound's going to work. There it goes. Tonight we're going to be trying to make, and I say trying, a three-sided box. And this is one of the ones I made from a piece of lovely burl wood that I got at one of the Christmas parties here a couple of years ago. Just a little pop-fit lid, hollowed out. The neat part of this process is the fact that we'll be turning it off center, and you can do that on any numbers of sides. Obviously, we start on center. In between, what I have is a couple of small points on our lathe here to allow us to set this up. And we're going to set up an index with your lathe. If your lathe doesn't have indexing, you can add to it. But what I went ahead and did was round some pieces out and set up the index for 120 degrees apart. And what we do is put this in between centers. It is. The post is a little off on this one. Then we'll is it going down the other way? It's locked. This is unlocked. This lathe.
We've always had this problem with this lathe. Liner didn't reach in.
Sure. What you do, let me start with where I was headed, Jordan. We can worry about typing up here in a second. But you come in with your piece once you get it rounded off. You set your index on the lathe, and then all you're trying to do is set your tool rest. Come along here and mark with a pencil your line. Rotate to your next index point at 120 degrees and mark your line, and then turn around and do the last one and mark it. Then you take it back out. Now, what we do is we're looking to set the diameter of a circle. The closer you get to the center of the object, the more radius you're going to have on the sides of your box. The further out you get, the flatter it's going to be. So you're going to get the most dramatic effect the further you can move from the edge. Now, when you go to pick your wood, you want to make sure you're dealing with a fairly hard quality wood that isn't too punky, something that's going to be stable, because there's going to be quite a bit of force exerted when you turn this off center and it's flopping around out here. You don't want a piece of wood that's going to come apart on you. Your safest way to turn is going to be in between centers, and that's what we're going to be doing. But if your wood isn't stable enough to resist those forces, you can have pieces that tear out. So that's one of those areas you do want to be careful with in the selection of the piece that you're going to be working on. And then when you go to set this radius that we're looking for, I'll take my center finder, and if I can find the center finder, that's what happens when you have a clear one. Come around here on the top, and you're going to align your center finder with the pieces. There we go. You're going to align the center of it here so that you can mark in toward your radius circle. So what you want to do is make sure the diameter that you've set will allow you to place the piece so that you get your cone for your live center on the edge. You don't want it out here where it's half hanging off. You want to make sure that point is far enough in to where you can get a good seated fix. So what we'll do is put our piece here. Hopefully we get a lathe that can set. Yeah, where's it clamped up to? Is that loose? That's the last thing we want, is anything coming loose. Now, that's your basic setup. Is you're going to have those 3 different points. If you want to do 4, or if you want to do 5, you can set any number of indexes and sides to the box that you want to make. And this technique will carry over. It isn't limited to making boxes that look like these. You can also make tool handles, screwdriver handles. You can do any number of projects. This is what may appear to a lot of people to be what they consider an advanced project, but in reality, it's more a beginner intermediate project, and it's a great skill builder because you can start with some basic tools in order to set this up and make it work. The roughing gouge is an excellent tool to start learning how to work any number of shapes that you're dealing with here, and the actual cuts are not radically different than you would have in just taking a square piece and turning it around. You will be turning a lot of air, but it teaches you this tool control that you're going to use to advance and do more sophisticated turnings. You can also take this same technique, and if you choose to alternate so that you want to make parallel-sided boxes, what we'll call these, this is when we're taking our 2 points and locating them in line with each other. But if you choose to move them off one point, so if you rotate a third point over, when you turn this, it sets in between centers this direction, it'll actually create a twisted box instead of a straight-sided box. So there's quite a few things you can advance into when you go to making this type of turning. The points that I've done is once I get set up in between centers, I also will mark where I want my layout for my box to be. On a traditional box, you would tend to, when it's between centers on center, want to make your tenons for both ends. But in this case, if you actually create tenons like you would have done on this type of box, you're going to see that you lose the ability to work as far out toward the perimeter of the points when you go to this position and try to turn off center. So you're then going to make a very more, you lose the flat-sidedness and it becomes a lot more cylindrical. You don't really pick up the fact that it's going to be as multifaceted as it is when you preserve and leave it flat at this point and allow yourself to put it in between these centers, if that makes sense. So we're going to wait, but we're going to mark and plan for here. I've got a tenon allocated for on this end of the box and another one on this end, and then I'm picking the point here in the middle where we're going to want to put the joint and create our lid versus our base of the box. So when we have got all of our marks done, we'll put it in between centers and go ahead and mark or separate a line in here for our top and bottom of the box. I'll use the thin parting tool, and we're going to come in here and go slightly down into the edge of the bowl, and then we're going to drop down and create the top part of the tenon that's going to be the receiver for the box. The reason we're going to go ahead and do that at this point in time, you can wait to do that once you've made this shape, but you've complicated or made life a little more difficult for yourself because when you start separating the box, when it has three sides, you're going to have the tendency for some chip out. So you'll have to really get good with your skew in order to start pommel cuts, or you can do what I'm fixing to do and go ahead and remove the wood that is going to turn into the point while it's still in its round shape, and it's the easiest to deal with. It'll make a little more sense once I get to the next steps in the project here, but it's going to be the pretty straightforward separation. 1, 2, 1, 2. One of the critical pieces that is different in making a three-sided box is dealing with the angle of the shoulder. On a traditional box, I would encourage you to undercut, both sides, the lid and the base of the box, so that this joint is seamless. But if you try to do that on a three-sided box, if you undercut, you're going to create a void. And I brought this handy-dandy little demonstration piece. You can see what happens if you cut and you're beveling out on the piece. You start getting a void at these corners. If you have a cut in the other direction, you're going to get a slice along here. And as we start separating and making the three sides, we'll use these lines that are on the wood as our guide to know how far to cut this piece. It's also important to keep an eye on the end of the piece where you have the vertical line, because if you go too far, as you can see on this piece, the box is not centered on this piece. And I did this intentionally to show you what can happen if you don't follow your guidelines and you cut more on one side than you do the other side as you begin developing each of the three pieces. What you're looking for is to try to get the box to where it is symmetrical on all the sides, so you'll wind up with it even amounts past the center of the circle. So the goals that we're looking for with those lines is to keep us on track. We've got our piece cut here. Now we can go ahead and throw it off center. And the fun begins.
You just do your separation at this point, don't watch it.
Right, because it's a little bit easier to deal with the cuts on the ends of the tenon, especially if you pick some of the styles. And if you were to go wrong in your cut and say you have a lapse in movement on your tool and you create a chip out, it's going to be less of a problem to deal with on the ends of the box, because you can choose to either shorten the box or you can use one of the techniques like I did here. The top of the box is going to be cut away most of the time, so that tenon, as you get rid of it, it's going to be rounded over. You can choose to do the slight dome top, or you can do a concave cut, and where each one of these would create a point coming out, and the same thing with the bottom of the box. So you have that opportunity if you did have a problem, or if you just chose that as a style. It's a little less critical on the way that particular box looks. But here at this connection between the two, once you're trying to get this tight fit, it's important for it to be flat. This tape is a great tape. So obviously when you're throwing anything this far off center, you want to make sure you're clearing your tool rest, so always rotate by hand before you fire it up so you don't have any nasty surprises. And then B, you want to make sure your tailstock is tight, but also when you first start turning, it has a tendency to apply a lot of those lateral forces to your wood, and you may see it loosen up. So the last thing you want to do is have a toothpick that you don't intend to have as a toothpick. So check it occasionally as you start your turning, and also get out of the line of fire as you begin to rotate. As you see, that's quite a bit of movement that we're dealing with here. Well, on any box that you make, on any box you make, you're going to be concerned with how you get a match back with your wood grain. But because you're typically always going to have an amount of tenon and you're going to lose something for your parting tool, unless you want to use a sleeve, another piece of wood that you can hollow and insert in there, you're going to have a certain amount of mismatch in the wood. So it depends on if you're getting paid enough commission or enough time to make those sleeves, or if you're using another type of method, because you're going to have at least that parting tool gap in between there that's a lost wood that is here. But in many cases, as you can see in this one, you get a grain seems to be fairly consistent. But, you know, you could also say, yeah, so you can limit, yeah, exactly. So, and of course in some woods it's what grain, the crazed look that you get. So those are choices you get to make. And then style and length of this tenon in here, I have a tendency to like a little more of a suction fit that you can accomplish with a little bit longer tenon. And with really short tenons, you have to get a pretty tight fit and hope the wood doesn't move much. Some people choose to cut this and wait a little while and see if the wood's going to stabilize or warp after you've hollowed it. Dry wood in this case is always going to be an important part. You don't want to try to make a box out of green wood unless you're really rough turning it and going to set it aside and try to finish it later. But that joint is never going to last if that wood warps or changes on you radically using the wet wood instead of a really good kiln dried wood. One of the great things about turning off center like this, it will definitely teach you some good technique on tool holding and movement, because you're going to be turning mostly air. The speed and the sharp tool will allow you to get a smoother cut as you work with the piece. So one of the things that's always makes you comfortable knowing you're possibly going to be electrocuted as well as embarrassed. So one of the things we want to watch for, any tool you're holding, whether you're doing this with a skew or whether you're doing it with a regular roughing gouge, you want to make sure you're holding the tool in a manner that's going to be able to do, of course, your fundamentals, your anchor, bevel touching first and then cut. But you need to be able to put your finger underneath your tool and on your tool rest. If you have a very small tool rest and larger hands, it may be more difficult. You may need to consider changing it. The reason I say that is, as the wood comes around, there's a tendency with an interrupted cut to catch the bounce. And what you're wanting to do is make sure you're not bouncing along as you're trying to make the cut. You need to be able to hold. If it does bounce you back, that's fine, but that finger up there keeps you from going further than you intend to into the wood. That's going to make you more consistent on your turning, so it's going to help you out in being able to accomplish a nice smooth cut. Certain woods will allow you to use certain tools more efficiently and give you a better cut than others. I have found many times on boxes that are in a medium softwood tend to do very well with the skew. You'll have a hard time getting a smooth cut with just your spindle roughing gouge. But as you, depending on your wood selection, this particular piece of mesquite, this honey locust mesquite that I think I picked up there with Craig, has a tendency to be a little bit brittle. So if you're very gentle and very slow, the skew will give you a smoother cut, but it also can have a tendency to maybe want to chip on you. So there are other cases where you take some of these medium softwoods, the roughing gouge will give you just a fairly coarse cut, and that's where the skew can really shine. You can get one you can almost sand at 220 and keep going. But the beauty of these is the variety of the woods and the variety of tools all can be made to work. So it's a good process as you go forward. I like to at least start off with the spindle roughing gouge just for speed, and it helps crank you along. So I got the tool anchored down on my hip, just swaying back and forth, doing nice gentle cuts. Closer you get to the finished shape, you'll have to just stop and check. As you can see, we've worked our way up to about 1/8 to a little less. Got a little bow going on here, so I'll need to take off more at this side, but this is where your lines start coming into play to help you out. The difference between those two sides and where we are on center, these lines will eventually go away, and that's why the marks on the ends are what we're also going to pay attention to, because if you accidentally go past that point, these lines are still going to be there for you. So you don't panic, you flip to the next side, and you'll be able to take off that side to the same amount. And when they meet up at the center, the points will always be on those two lines on the ends that you have to compare it to. That finger is really acting like a depth gauge here. So as you take a gentle cut, you feel how far in and if you're going straight. It isn't mandatory that you go straight. As you can see on the box that I've got up here, the sides of that are tapered. You can choose to cut in on the ends of this, and we're getting close. This just a little bit of a touch. Looks like we're slightly indexed off. And I see why. I'm running. Wonder we got. That's why we're off.
Put that down as far into the centric as your line of your circle you drove?
No, actually what we're trying to do is just get the intersection line here. We're trying to get to the 120-degree point.
Intersection line.
Right.
That's your reference.
Exactly. Because we know in order for that to be balanced, I want to take the same amount off this side as I do off this side as I do the next side. So these reference guidelines that we've got, that's why those are important. Of course, if you don't put your point right on that line, you may have a little irregularity.
What's the grade speed?
Billion miles an hour. I'll typically turn somewhere around the 2,000. This one's showing about 2,200 on there. Jimmy would say, what are you going so slow for? We just go to the next point on rotation. Slide also helps to use to mark all your points whenever you're doing your initial setup. I use an awl to knock a little indentation there for us. Getting really close to our points, you can see the line right here is where it's cutting, and we're trying to get to the mark that's on the pencil right here because the line is starting to fade away. You can barely make it out on the top. Again, the key is nice, gentle cuts. You can see this wood is giving me just a little bit of ripple across here, but the sanding part is what we're trying to do. And as you notice, the only thing left of my line here is just right at the tips, and those are the areas that are most likely to have broken away. These are Robert Sorby centers. I picked these up at SWAT, I think, a couple of years ago. And the main reason I wanted was to do some of these smaller pieces this way. They make them in at least a couple different sizes that I picked up from Sorby. And it was closer in diameter, as you can see, to the lab center, and it made it a lot easier to do this kind of work. Just nice, soft, gentle cuts, not getting in a hurry. A little more to go. You know, on a lot of the other wood turning type projects, I do, but on this particular one, it's really more about feel and judging the depth that you're going to, because you're cutting just really parallel. You don't have if you're looking for the profile, when I start doing a curved edge, that is when I definitely am looking at that outward shape that I'm aiming for. And that's going to give you that outer profile, but when it's straight, it's straight. So as long as you don't see yourself going crooked when you want to be straight, that would be the only other purpose. But that's because you have a nice straight tool rest and your finger holding you there, that movement and keeping a straight line is really pretty simple. That's why I say it's not, at this point, overly complicated project for beginners, so it's a good way to get into this type of work. Now at this point you start comparing and saying, all right, if I went too far on any particular side, do I need to back up? The beauty is you can. You can go back to another one of the centers and move it back around and adjust where you need to be. If you're happy with it, then it's time to move back to center and create your tendons. Here is where you want to have a little bit of caution. But you want to, again, check, move a little bit closer. Go ahead and establish a little more depth at your separation between the top and the bottom. Don't want to separate it quite yet. And I'm not trying to achieve my final tenon size. I just want to get circular. This D-Way parting tool is a great thin parting tool. It's slightly tapered, so it also helps cut down on the binding that you get with a purely straight blade. We need to come a little bit further. Hadn't quite got all the way around, but really close here. Now looking at separating or creating your tendons on both the top and the bottom, you can obviously use a parting tool, but this is one of the areas in which I'd say it's recommended you maybe break out your skew. Learn a little bit about pommel cuts. These will allow you to cut down on the amount of chippage you could get at that particular location. Those are just some very straightforward, peeling cuts with a skew to get us down. I'm using some pin jaws to hold this tonight because the size of this box is small enough to where it won't use the smallest number 2 jaws for the chuck that I have, so the pin jaws seem to work pretty well. The main thing is giving them a little bit of a bite right up against the end because they have a very small flange or turn in on that particular set of jaws. And of course, parting in between centers, the last thing you want to do is try to cut all the way through because the pressure from the jaws will create a bind most of the time and you can get yourself in trouble as opposed to when you have something mounted in chuck and you're just separating a piece that isn't being pushed by the tailstock into the rest of the work. So normally I take a saw and go through there. I'll do a quick bait and switch. I already had this one ready to go where it could get placed in the chuck. Lovely. I think that's a small problem. Wow. See right here. Take it off. Wind up fighting more than one problem at a time. I'm also not used to having a cable around my neck. What I've done is gone ahead and mounted the lid into the tenon, and I'm just merely coming in here and making a point for the drill. Obviously, a piece this small, we could probably dodge. Having drilled it out, we could just cut it. But for the sake of technique that we normally follow, come up here and now, whether you like to do the bottom of your lid or the bottom of your box first or your lid first is normally a matter of preference. One of the things that I found is that this way you can stop and you don't have to change twice. If you do your lid first and you set your diameter that you're going to follow, one of the things that you really ought to check is how much wood you have left. It beats starting over. I have yet to find one of these that I can make bigger. So I set my calipers, then it's a good idea to go ahead and transfer that as the worst case scenario. Now I know as long as I don't exceed that size on the piece that we're working on, we should be in pretty good shape. Going to wind up being somewhere around this point. Now, what I mentioned earlier, this is one of the critical points that you want to be dead flat as you go across the bottom. And you have the ability to do a technique similar to what you do on a box when you are trying to get the next set of rings stacked up and you have a flat center. You have the ability to cut, but you also can use a sanding block to go across here and get this flat, which we'll do a little bit of both to show you the differences in those techniques. So when you issue your tool, you can also check it with your skew. What you're looking for is to see, when you view this straight down on this line, do I have gaps here? You know, the points appear to be a little bit higher, and there appears to be just a small piece on the ends. Now I can keep working that with the skew, or you can merely go over and pull up your handy dandy flat skew, which is 80 grit on a block of wood. See if they get you where you needed to be. Fortunately or unfortunately, that's where you can also go wrong if you get a little too hasty. Speed kills boxes. So doing a box in a demo is kind of like a death wish. We'll call that probably flat enough. So we're continually going to work to refine what this is, but this piece is far simpler than dealing with the bottom of the box. Two of my favorite box tools are one of Jimmy Clue's box scrapers that is specifically cut so that you can go in at an angle, and what you do is you line up the tool so that the outer edge here is going to be parallel with the ways of the lathe, and you can scrape down the side of the box, and if you want a 90-degree corner on the bottom of this box, it'll give you a nice sharp point to go in and clean that up, and also go across the bottom and work with the rounded piece to create the shape you want there. The other style that I have gotten is one that was by Cindy Drozda's tools, and she has one that allows you to work on a radius box. It's sometimes often hard to get a good clean cut with a 90-degree corner, especially if you don't have a tool as good as Jimmy's, but this one will allow you to create more of an arc or a sweep because you can choose to radius in from the very bottom of your box up the side instead of having a 90-degree corner there. So both those come in handy on many situations. But find that Jimmy's is really good for fine-tuning your diameter and working on the side of the box. painful. Like any end grain piece that you're working with, it's going to be easier to cut to the side as you come across the grain of that wood as opposed to pushing in. This tool will do a fairly good job on either one up to a point in depth. The deeper you go, the more important your fundamentals are, and we work in steps coming back toward the side and hollowing on an end grain because of that directionality that is cutting into the end grain is much more difficult than cutting across it at the end. So that is the reason you can use this tool both directions. This is good for coming and finding that center of the bottom of the box and cleaning up the hole that's left over by the drill point, and also to get rid of any little bumps that you may have there. So we'll quickly move, and hopefully we can get a fit here. Same principle on the bottom of the box. We'll come in here and set it up to do a drill down the center. Now's the fun part. As you are working in on the box, this piece we actually need to get cut flat. This isn't an area where we're going to really be able to sand. Hopefully we did a fair job, but most of the time it's going to need some adjustment after we've done our parting, and we will try to clean that up a little bit. And if your touch is gentle, you get a nice straight line. If it's not, you wind up with a big chunk out of your wood, and that's when your opportunity to do your pommel cuts here and get rid of that chip out can happen, and you have a design opportunity. Jimmy Clues has recommended a kind of a taper fit approach to most of his boxes. That's what I'm working on here is as we get closer to the final diameter, we're actually going to bevel in a little bit until we get the check fit on our lid. And then after we get that determined, then we're going to turn around and work closer to the bottom over here and bevel that direction, leaving a hump halfway in between. And that helps fine tune that fit, and then you start working just very slowly on the hump in order to try to get down to a fairly good, hopefully, box fit. Almost. Now at this point, I want it to be a pretty tight fit, more than a box fit, because we're going to wind up turning the lid. And once I've removed most of the wood, in this next step, we'll actually take the tailstock back away. Now here you can either choose to go back to skew, or you can work on playing with spindle gouge or any of your favorite tools. If you have a slight difference in, say, you didn't keep the thickness of your box the same, if your taper is off, and once you go to reassemble your box, you've got a slight misalignment in the diameter, don't panic. There's a way to fix it. It is also an opportunity at this point where you can start looking at the finish of your quality cut. Even with the old spindle rough and gouge, just came out with a fairly smooth cut over the top of it. But by merely coming over here with your power sander, yes, it does have power. We'll turn it on. You can come in here and fine tune any slight misalignments. The main thing you want to do is make sure you got your points correctly aligned before you start that sanding, because you'll be sanding a lot after that point to try to get back to where it should be. So if there was any of those minor differences between the two, then you just come over here and do a little bit of work now and get it polished up, and then you can start your finish cuts with your lid. Pass, but what you're determining at this stage is how much of the shape you want to have curved. You can choose to do a really rounded dome top. You can do a fairly mild. You can see the differences. Of course, if you were good at embellishment, I guess you could turn one of these into an owl. you kind of have the opportunities to play with your creativeness. Some people will go ahead and make a knob or a finial, or add a drill piece to add a third component finial of an accent wood in here at this point. The main thing that you're looking for is to try to get a smooth transition. You can see currently, right now, I've started a little steeper cut, so then it changes to more of a flat. So the key thing you always want to avoid is having a curve that has an interruption in it. You're always looking, regardless of what turning, those are just awkward. So you want to make sure you get a nice clean cut and you get your transitions to where they're smooth and flowing. Speed is helping you out here. As I'm working with the spindle gouge, you have the opportunity to use the tool to actually put a little bit of force onto the end of the work, keep your lid from popping off. A little bit of haste there, but now at this stage, normally I would recommend that you move it, fine-tune the fit on your lid. Of course, that may be acceptable. I've seen, yeah, we can live with that one. Normally, I'd put it in a wooden jam chuck, turn around and finish the bottom of this piece. If it will fit, we'll try to see if we can just reverse it onto the pin jaws. Really don't recommend this because it messes up your tenon most of the time, but due to speed and the timing that we have to do these demos, can't really afford to make a jam chuck out of another piece of wood tonight. Now, one of the interesting things that is done by Robbie the Woodturner, he actually will make a circular recess in here that actually edges of the wood, so you're left with three small legs. Haven't been as much of a fan of that particular technique just because I know how wood over time has a tendency, you take small slivers, it's going to, somebody drop it or mess it up, it's going to crack or pop. The other thing that I have done in this box is this is where I did the pommel cut instead of the flat bottom. That allows you to go in here and do a slight radius on this edge and get rid of some of the material, but allow you to do a slight convex shape to the bottom of the box. Just for safety's sake. If you can work between centers, work between centers is always going to potentially save your peace and your pride. Never get in a hurry, never get aggressive. It will bite you every time. Hence the reason for the jam, Chuck. Fun. I've got it. This thing's already gone there. Yeah, if you actually take a piece of wood in between your chuck and turn it to the interior diameter of your box, you jam fit it on there. But I can't get this one. It's too small to fit inside the box, which would have been the preference. Yeah. Well, war wounds and all, there it goes. We got it to at least finish in an hour that we were after. Well, there's a lot of variety that you can pull off with these. Obviously, it's a project that will teach you a lot of various techniques. So the main thing is play with it, have fun, and use a jam chuck for your finish.